Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first congratulate the organizers of this beautiful event which I'm attending for the first time. And of course, I would have loved to spend more time with you people. I think the who's who of the IT industry is here. I have got the occasion to interact with them in various issues, both in the Standing Committee on Finance, as well as on the Committee on Data Protection Bill, Personal Data Protection Bill, which, as you know, has been withdrawn day before yesterday. I was listening very intently to some of the deliberations that was there just when I reached here, and the panel discussion talked about cloud, how to be safe in cloud, and several other issues. We have been of late engaging with the Indian as well as the big tech multinationals and the small entrepreneurs, the startups, relating to the competition law in the light of the Digital Markets Act that the EU passed recently. Listening to all this makes me realize the value of regulation. See, when we are in the space of IT or IT-enabled services, whether it is use of AI or ML or IoT, you know the way technology-enabled services have grown, the way the bundling takes place, it's so complex that regulations have become a challenge. Now, what is the challenge? What is basically the challenge? There are three important things which I think any regulation should take care of. Number one would be protection of the citizen. Number two, ensuring that a fair market develops. I'm very careful while saying this because I think gone are the days where the regulation was concentrated mostly on control methodologies or control protocols. It is definitely much more to do with the development of the market going with regulation. And then the third important thing is to promote innovation. So a regulation has to take care of these three pillars. One, citizen protection, no questions about it. Number two, ensuring that the market is fair, develops fairly. And number three is promoting innovation. Now, given these three sometimes contradicting or sometimes overlapping domains or subdomains under the overall domain or space of regulation, what kind of regulation would deliver all that we discuss? Security by design, privacy by design, you can talk about even, people talk about human rights by design. Since a lot of activities of citizens is now being read into Article 21, which is right to life, which is a fundamental right, you realize that the primacy of all regulation has to be eventually the citizen, particularly in the Indian context, because it is a fundamental right. In several jurisdictions outside the country, it is quite possible, I could rattle examples, but it is a fact that several of these rights are given statutorily by passing legislations. But in our country, since it is being read into Article 21, it is a part of fundamental rights, which is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and therefore cannot be taken away under any circumstance whatsoever. It's inalienable. While saying all this, we must also realize that there are reasonable restrictions or exceptions to this fundamental right, and it is within that domain that whatever exemptions or whatever extra regulations that is required to be put in the interest of the sovereignty of the country, international relations, and some such things, public order, could be brought in. Therefore, on one hand, we have technology galloping at a rate unseen before. We have Wave 3 applications coming in where jurisdictions don't matter anymore. Even if we were to pinpoint transgressions, the question is, prosecution is a problem in a peer-to-peer kind of a network, in a peer-to-peer kind of a protocol. This is happening with crypto. This is happening with even a blockchain kind in a public blockchain. This is also happening with several of the blended or bundled products that are coming in. The kind of regulation that one can have are largely 5 types. First is to have an adaptive regulation. That is, you just don't make the laws and forget. You adapt. So as technology moves, you also move. But this kind of regulation is more reactive in nature. It's post hoc, it's not ex ante. But if you have a regulatory sandbox kind of an approach, it is kind of action research, which we do, the scientists do, where the sandboxes provide the environment for developing new applications, new systems, new technologies, see their implications without the rigors of the entire regulation being forced on them. Then we have a third kind, which is outcome-based regulation, where the most important thing is performance. How the players to be regulated perform, and keeping that in mind, you have the regulations. You have a fourth type, and that is risk-weighted regulation. The risk-weighted regulation would mean that you don't have a one-size-fit-all regulation, but you have a graded regulation. You have the more riskier components of a particular action or a particular series of actions being regulated more heavily compared to something which is less risky. And the last one is about collaborative regulation, where multiple stakeholders across geographies and jurisdictions and across all spaces, that is a whole of kind of a government or a whole of ecosystem kind of an approach, is brought in. That's the kind of regulation. Now, these are the 5 broad categories in which regulations can be placed. While these regulations or these categories of regulations do not operate in silos, most regulations worldwide, including you take EU GDPR, you take the current Digital Markets Act, the Services Act, anywhere, would be having a mixture of this. It would depend on what society it is going to, the service is going to be delivered, what kind of society it is, and most importantly, what kind of governance the Constitution wants the citizens to have, the executive to deliver, and the parliament to enact. These are the contexts in which a regulation has to be formulated. And therefore, any cut and paste kind of an approach to regulation will not work. And it will not work particularly in a country size of India, particularly in a country where 25% of rural India do not have access to even a telephone. About 35% of rural areas do not have quality internet services. So when we are talking about regulation, we have to think about all these aspects, which are unique to this country and not there in several countries. And this is what we are grappling with in the Committee on Personal Data Protection Bill when we are discussing this. And this is what we grapple with all the time when we are discussing about the antitrust laws, of the antitrust activities of the big tech companies in the Finance Committee, which we are currently discussing. If we look at what we want out of these regulations, there are three basic things that we would want, or three basic architectures that you can follow. One is the consent-based privacy kind of a model. Our EU GDPR, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulations, are largely consent-based. And when we have a consent-based framework, obviously the compliance costs are very high. You can, of course, determine by legislation the level of compliance you want to have. But once again here, the context becomes important. If the citizen's fundamental right is right to privacy, then the consent framework becomes tougher and the compliance cost, therefore, is bound to be higher compared to a situation where privacy is only statutorily given to the citizens. There is another model or another framework that you can follow. And when I say all this, it is not just applicable to privacy law, to IT laws, to intermediary rules, to cyber crime, cyber laws. I am talking about all IT related legislations. So one is the consent-based framework. The other one, which is very important in a country like India, and which is what I love, which is what I have written about extensively at various places, is the accountability model. And why I say it is important is the consent, if it is uninformed, is of no consequence. Just because a consent has been given, a service provider cannot cause harm to the data principal or the citizen. So an accountability-based model would ensure that irrespective of the kind of consent that has been given, the nature of consent that is given, the legislation is loaded in favor of ensuring accountability of the data fiduciary or the person who is collecting the data, or a player who is in the IT space. There is, of course, a third model which is more market-based. And this market-based model would work only when ownership is established. Ownership of data, ownership of applications, ownership of, services. Sometimes that's also a problem because of the nature of technology itself. When we are discussing about various situations emerging in our country, and I describe some of them, where basic services, internet services, are not available to citizens, some kind of a hybrid situation of using physical as well as technological innovation may be very relevant. And that's what is probably being practiced by the banks now. Some kind of offline processing and then brought to online real-time systems. So I was very happy when Mr. Sahu came and approached me to talk about, to tell me about this congregation that you have, the forum that you have. We, of course, get time to discuss many of these nuances in detail in the standing committees. But I think what is important, that a regulation is as good or as bad depending on how it delivers. In India, implementation has always been a problem. In any kind of legislation, my senior, Mr. S.N. Tripathi, would agree to this, that in anything in India, the problem is implementation. And this implementation is an issue because of the, as I said, because of 3-4 factors. One is the size, one is the complexity of society, one is the inequities in society, whether it is social inequity or economic inequity, or it is even digital inequity or technological inequity. The capabilities, the opportunities available to all the people to avail a regulation and get benefit out of it is actually lopsided. So I would appeal to all of you who are present here and who are probably watching this online, that you have a singularly important role in spreading digital literacy if you want any kind of regulation, whether it is beneficial to you, whether it fits into any of the models that I talked about, to succeed. If you want a legislation to be effective in achieving the objectives of transactions in virtual currencies, you have to educate. You have to bring awareness of all the stakeholders involved. We have interacted with almost all virtual currency service providers, exchanges together. And we have asked this question. Very little is done on this front. So instead of keeping technology and the technology-enabled services within the 4 walls of the boardroom, within the 4 walls of the company, it is, I think, not just the government's role, government's duty, government's job, but job of the companies, job of the service providers to educate the people, to bring in that digital literacy in which the full potential of an application, full potential of a service can be availed by them. Unless that happens, the pull factor that is responsible for success of any kind of technology diffusion in this country will not happen. Push strategy doesn't really work. So while making regulations, we in the committees that we are there are conscious of this fact that while we promote protection of citizens, his data, therefore consent-based work, and since your theme is optimizing the world of remote work, the most important thing that emerged after the pandemic, post-pandemic, during the first and the second wave, particularly with relation to education, related to e-commerce platforms, digital application of digital technology. I don't have to quote the figures, you know it all, how it has blossomed enormously. And with that, the challenges have become even enormous. There are children's data there. There are data of young girls over there. You have to bring in regulation to protect them. But at the same time, many of those young girls could be innovators as well, so we have to promote them. So when I keep hearing from many people, okay, this is how the regulation should be, and this is from people like you who are so well-informed, digitally well-informed, we sitting in position, see, I have had a career in civil services as well. I have had a career in teaching as well. I am now a member of parliament. So I have seen almost everything that part of the legislature, part of the executive, and I've not been a part of the legislature, but I'm an advocate now, so I also know how legislations are being made. So this is something that worries us all the time. The cut and paste method, since EU has done it, why don't we do it? You did it in 2018, the EU GDPR. After 2018, not long ago, the size of each one of the European Union countries is sometimes smaller than some of our states. And therefore, when I said that we need to have state-level data protection authorities and there cannot be one behemoth of a national data protection authority, I meant that we need to have delegation where a law can be implemented properly. Access to the law, access to technology has to be uniform as far as possible for that man in Malkangiri or that man in Surat and that man in Delhi as well. And that access has to be affordable. That access has to be qualitative as well. I speak all this because these are the challenges in framing regulation nowadays. Whether it is in the field of, because everywhere there is technology. So if I'm talking about a banking regulation, if I'm talking about an e-commerce regulation under the Consumer Protection Act, we are grappling with these issues all the time. And that is where people like you, people who are coming from the IT industry, should work closely with governments, with parliamentarians, to not only help develop these regulations in the most practical and pragmatic way possible, by keeping in mind the interest of those who do not have even access to, as I said, internet or even a mobile telephone. India has been the leader in mobile telephony, in mobile application services compared to anywhere in the world. But as I said, the figures are 25% of rural India do not have a smartphone. I have not, as a part of my, MP Lite program, I distributed tablets to young students because they could actually take advantage of online education. Now, this is one great intervention that all of you can do. All people, all companies who are in this space can do. And if you do that, actually, you are actually developing the ecosystem. Unless the entire ecosystem develops, the regulation would not be able to deliver its intended benefits, however good the regulation is. So I end my deliberation with you, my interaction with you, with this appeal that whatever regulation you want, you work closely with the government, but keep in mind this particular strata of society, you have to reduce technological inequity. You have to reduce internet inequity. You have to reduce digital literacy inequity. With these words, I once again thank the organizers for inviting me to this place. It's indeed a privilege to be here. I wish I could have spent more time with you people. I am actually rushing because I had invited before some of my colleagues, about 10 members of parliament, to make an advocacy group to influence or to advise government on what the technology laws should be. And incidentally, this actually marries so well. They will be waiting in my house to discuss this particular thing. We have an agenda. The current framework of, I can share something with you, the current framework of developing an ecosystem is what is the government in the Ministry of IT is actually grappling with, where each one of these laws will have a place of prominence, but the harmonization of all these laws so that there is no regulatory arbitrage is very important. You must also realize that some of these IT-related regulations may not be in harmony with those regulations which are general purpose but had been drafted long, long ago. The complexity is enormous, but I think all of us can sit down to solve all this. Thank you so much.